In the world of ideas, the utopias and dystopias of the turbulent 20th century, Aldous Huxley stands out as a key figure in troubled human knowledge. From a young age, he began to fill the press with essays, novels, and stories that offered a biting and ironic critique of the excesses of the modern world, delivering as the culmination of this period the famous novel Brave New World. After warning about the advent of a scientific dictatorship where people would comfortably accept their enslavement, bathed in pleasures and constant consumption, and concerned about the course of a human world lacking dignity, glory, or wonders, Huxley evolves toward a spiritual rebirth, dedicating himself to reflecting on human consciousness and its connection to a higher divine reality, even resorting to the use of spiritual psychedelic substances to explore the human mind and what transcends it. Join us to learn not only about the life, but also the main ideas of Aldous Huxley's work up until his final years, of his earthly departure.
This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches. For those asking how to support the new encyclopedia, I bring you the news that we have created a Patreon with exclusive documentaries on the most controversial topics, with live seminars taught by us, and with several more benefits. Your support is essential to keep this project alive. You can find the link below. And in case you don't have an international card for Patreon, we have several payment options for you, and you will also be included in the community. We look forward to seeing you. And without further ado, let's start today's video. Thank you.
Aldous Leonard Huxley was born on July 26, 1894, in Surrey County, England. His family background places him within a prominent British intellectual dynasty, the Huxleys and the Arnolds, who, despite not being nobility, considered their intelligence their most valuable noble title. From the union between the Huxleys and the Arnolds, Aldous inherited a double spiritual and intellectual current: scientific and poetic humanism from his father's side. Aldous's grandfather was Thomas Henry Huxley, a famous biologist, self-taught scholar, and Victorian polemicist, nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog, not only because he was a close friend, but also a passionate defender of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. The son of Darwin's Bulldog, Leonard Huxley, Aldous Huxley's father, worked as an assistant teacher at the prestigious Charterhouse, one of the oldest schools in the country, and later he became a renowned journalist and literary editor of La Nación, a discreet but essential figure in the intellectual development of his children. On his mother's side, Aldous Huxley's mother was Julia Frances Arnold, the granddaughter of Dr. Thomas Arnold of Rugby, an educational reformer of great influence in Victorian England, and she was his niece, in addition to the poet and critic Matthew Arnold, one of the leading representatives of 19th century humanism. Julia, Aldous's mother, was also one of the first women in England to obtain a first in English in 1882, which is the highest academic distinction in English language studies, and she went on to found her own school for girls, a pioneering achievement at that time. From the fusion of these two branches, the scientific and the literary, arises the essential balance that would define Aldous's work: an analytical mind that aspires to the rational order of knowledge, and a soul deeply sensitive to beauty, ethics, and the spiritual dimension of existence. Returning to Aldous Huxley, he is the third child of that marriage. Since he was a child, Aldous saw himself as a different kind of boy. His head, disproportionately large, delayed his ability to walk until he was 2 years old, which is why his brothers nicknamed him the Ogre. However, behind that initial physical clumsiness hides a precocious mind and a contemplative gaze that, according to him, leads him. They remember him spending long periods sitting, observing, quote, the strangeness of things and drawing, all framed by a humble and measured character. His early education takes place at San Bruno's Day School, and later in 1901, the family moves to Prior's Field, where his mother opens her own school. In 1905, 1902, which according to several former students was a place where kindness and understanding prevailed, a reflection of his mother's calm character. In the fall of 1903, at the age of 9, Aldous enters Hillside Boarding School near Godalming. The discipline there is strict, often severe, but according to his biographers, Aldous's strength of character allows him to get through it. And although he does not stand out academically, he shows a lively intellectual curiosity and an adventurous spirit, which is evident in his long walks and his fondness for climbing. In September 1908, he enters Eton College on a scholarship from the British monarchy. Initially, he intends to follow in his grandfather's footsteps and study biology, hoping to dedicate himself to medicine or science. However, that same year, two almost consecutive tragedies deeply mark and change his life and character. On one hand, the melancholic death of his mother in November 1908 causes him to withdraw emotionally into himself. And on the other hand, suffering from an eye infection in 1911, which leaves him at risk of blindness for a long time. But Aldous, according to his biographers, faces that eye infection with courage, without self-pity or resignation. Aldous even learns the reading system for the blind, known as Braille. He plays the piano by ear, and on cold nights, reads under the sheets with an improvised lamp. From these episodes, Aldous Huxley's inclination toward introspection, contemplation, and solitude is reinforced, like a laboratory of the spirit that shapes his reserved temperament and will accompany him throughout his life. Fortunately, Aldous Huxley's eyesight begins to improve. In April 1912, just as he begins to receive private tutoring, such as history lessons from the famous historian George Clark, and later he travels to Marburg, Germany, where he studies German and music. Finally, in October 1913, he enters Balliol College, no less than one of the educational institutions that was part of the University of Oxford, where, still limited by his fragile eyesight, he devotes himself completely to English literature. Now entering adulthood, Aldous was quite a tall man, standing at 1.93 meters, which, along with his poor eyesight and modulated voice, gave him the appearance of a distinguished young man. The atmosphere at Oxford exudes the confidence of an England secure in its military, scientific, and industrial progress, giving its citizens a sense of growth and positioning themselves as the greatest empire of the time. The British felt like the most elevated citizens on the planet. On the Oxford University campus, music, intellectual debates, and the arts that are beginning to emerge in modernity are alive. Politically, the 1910s is a time marked by a certain youthful indifference and little political participation from English students. Most of Aldous Huxley's classmates profess a mild English-style conservatism, more aesthetic than ideological. In this environment, Aldous Huxley joins the Oxford Socialist Society in 1914 at the age of 19. Although his inclination leans more toward art, literature, and philosophy, expressing his hatred of economism and showing little affinity with political action. So he soon leaves his brief involvement in that socialist organization. The calm of those glorious global years in Oxford is abruptly broken in August 1914, with the outbreak of what would later be called the First World War. And a few days after this, another tragedy strikes them. His brother Trevenant suddenly commits suicide, causing great sadness in Aldous Huxley. Furthermore, Aldous, unable to enlist in the military due to his visual impairment, is left isolated from his friends deployed on the battlefield. He is isolated from the collective war experience that marks that entire generation of young Englishmen during the conflict. Huxley finds himself in an uncertain position, both economically and existentially. The war, although turning in favor of England and its allies, leaves serious economic disruptions throughout Europe and in that nation. This gives rise to a growing pessimism at the social level, which affects art and literature. His visual ability remains weak, so the paths to working in a laboratory or in medicine were already definitely closed. Nevertheless, that same obstacle will push him toward the destiny that will consecrate him to literature, graduating in English literature in 1915. The war, on a personal level, leaves him excluded from the generational experience of those who had fought on the front lines. And the end of that war, which officially took place on November 11, 1915, catches him by surprise, without fortune or a clear direction. In February 1919, at the age of 24, he leaves his recent position as a teacher at Eton College, and shortly after joins the editorial team of the Athenaeum Literary Weekly. There, Huxley hones his talent for criticism and social observation, and consolidates a literary style that combines erudition and irony. That same year, on July 10, 1919, he marries Maria Nice, a young Belgian woman he had met before the war, and with whom he had endured a forced separation of more than 2 years. The wedding, held in Bethlehem, Belgium, symbolizes for both of them a reunion with peace after the chaos in Europe. Then, the newlyweds settle in a modest apartment in the north of London. Aldous Huxley, in need of income, takes on multiple jobs. In addition to contributing to the Athenaeum, he works as a drama critic for a newspaper and also writes for a magazine, where he pens articles on aesthetics and design. These jobs allow him to get by, and at the same time, sharpen his perspective on that emerging bourgeois world that he would later satirize in his novels. In the midst of this hectic working life, the first written works of Aldous Huxley begin to appear. In February 1920, he publishes an anthology of short stories called Limbo. Then, in May, he publishes a poetry collection titled Leda, and in November of the following year, in 1921, his first novel is published, called The Scandals of Crumb. It was a biting satire of the intellectual environment in England after the war. 6 months later, another anthology of short stories comes out called Deadly Labyrinths, which starts to position him as a new voice in English literature, refined, ironic, and sharp to the point of skepticism. By 1921, Aldous Huxley leaves London and moves to Italy in search of a milder climate and a lower cost of living. And from there, he will begin to write his most representative works of the interwar period, the one between the First and Second World Wars. Well, in January 1923, he signs a contract with a publishing house that guarantees him a stable income in exchange for delivering 2 books per year. He is asked that one of them be a novel. In just 2 months, during which he stays in the south of France, he writes Dance of Satyrs, a novel that sharply portrays the moral disillusionment of the post-war era. During this creative burst, Huxley publishes nearly a dozen works, including short stories and novellas, whose literary quality is establishing him as one of the most promising British authors of the 1920s. By the end of that decade, already settled in the south of France, Huxley had achieved a well-established prestige as one of the great intellectuals of his generation. He alternated publishing novels with essays, as well as short stories, all with a significant and penetrating social critique. And in that bright Mediterranean climate, he began to conceive the work that would synthesize his vision of the modern world, a work that would leave his mark for the rest of history. Written between 1931 and 1932 as a dystopian mirror of the promises and threats of human progress, he would write Brave New World, a work that would rise among the pinnacles of 20th century literature. In April 1931, settled in his Mediterranean refuge, Aldous Huxley began to write what he would call his Bad Utopia, one of the most representative works of the dystopian genre, along with Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury and 1984 by George Orwell. Between April and August, the work took shape under the final title of Brave New World, translated into Spanish as Un Mundo Feliz. Finally published in February 1932 when Aldous Huxley was 38 years old, Brave New World received an enthusiastic reception in England. In its first year, more than 13,000 copies were sold. The critics celebrate Huxley as a modern prophet who portrays the distortions of a civilization dominated by material comfort, technology, and the bureaucracy of pleasure. In the United States, the reception is colder and more shocking. Many readers consider his vision excessively bleak and even a pessimistic mockery of progress and of the American faith in the mechanical happiness of technological progress. Modern material. What is the plot of the work? The novel imagines a future civilization governed by Fordism, a satirical reference to Henry Ford and his system of mass production. In this system, science and technology have become the new religion, displacing Christianity and any other form of spirituality. Huxley, rather than criticizing scientific progress itself, criticizes the way in which science, when applied to human life, ceases to be neutral and becomes an instrument of control, leading not to greater moral, spiritual, or emotional development, but to a profound regression of the human condition, a loss of human dignity at the hands of cold and all-powerful technology in this future society. The loss of freedom is not imposed through violence or open repression, but rather the ruling oligarchy makes citizens love their servitude. To achieve this, the state perfects a system that eliminates individuality from its very origin. Genetic engineering standardizes human production, creating a kind of predestined castes from birth, which in the book are known as alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons. They would be conditioned from a young age not only to accept, but to desire the role they were meant to have in that society. At the same time, psychological conditioning continues later through propaganda, slogans, and what is called hypnopedia, a form of teaching repeated during sleep that instills the essential values of that society. Finally, chemical control completes this entire process of control. Soma, as it is called in the story, is a perfect drug with no side effects. It guarantees instant happiness. It eliminates inner conflicts, existential doubts, and any temptation for rebellion. But this regime of absolute stability comes at a price. The New World has sacrificed art, culture, and even love and spirituality. In this world of Huxley, works like those of Shakespeare are capable of stirring intense emotions, so they are considered dangerous and are replaced by empty and repetitive entertainment. Human passions are suppressed in this society of the brave New World because they generate instability. Mandatory promiscuity is imposed to avoid emotional attachment between couples and emotional depth. The idea of God or a creator is completely eliminated, since sacrifice, courage, and the pursuit of higher principles did not fit in a society designed for permanent comfort. The result is a humanity turned into satisfied automatons, without pain, but also without real emotions, without real happiness, without greatness, without true free will, and much less without any longing for glory. Almost at the end of Huxley's work, this idea reaches its clearest formulation in the words of the villain himself, Mustafa Munt, who states the phrase that sums up the argument of the work, "Happiness never has greatness." This statement condenses the essential message of this work by Huxley. When a society sacrifices freedom, truth, and human dignity in the name of comfort, what could be called a happy world can be achieved, but never a truly human world. It's very common to see comparisons between the work Brave New World and George Orwell's 1984, who, by the way, had briefly been a student of Huxley at Eton College. These comparisons end up sealing their place in the history of modern ideas. After the publication of Orwell's novel years later, in 1949, Aldous Huxley wrote him a complimentary but disagreeing letter. He acknowledged the greatness of the book, but he warns that the future will not be dominated by the brutal coercion of fear through the use of violence, as in 1984, but rather by a more subtle, almost imperceptible, and even complacent control. The control of fleeting pleasure, psychological manipulation, and voluntary servitude. In his view, the men of the future will learn to love their slavery. Although they will live in precarious conditions and with more than limited freedom, they will be more than numbed by comfort and entertainment. Time, according to some, seems to have proven Aldous Huxley right, while the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century embodied Orwell's nightmare. The world of endless consumption, constant entertainment, and massive persuasive propaganda disguised as culture. It is the one that will characterize the West during the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century, reflecting this vision of Huxley, of submission through satisfaction and the numbing of the spirit under the hypnotic glow of modern progress. There's no need to control anyone by force because almost no one is interested in transcending or rebelling against the system. Huxley foresaw very well the future trend of what has been called social engineering, in which a small group of well-trained technicians will have, like never before, thanks to mass media and science, the ability to shape and condition social behavior anywhere in the world to suit their interests. As Huxley himself would say years later, if the first half of the 20th century was that of technical engineers, the second half could very well be that of social engineers. And the 21st century, he supposed, would be the era of world governments, a scientific system, castes, and the brave new world. Starting in the mid-1930s, Huxley underwent a profound shift in his thinking and in his literature. The satirical, biting writer of the 1920s, who dissected the excesses of the modern world with irony, was now transforming into a moral and idealistic thinker. Now, Huxley was delving into the profound fields of spirituality, aspiring to and seeking to reconcile science, philosophy, and religion. He moves from a critical portrayal of society to a broader reflection on the human condition, especially on the place of man and his spirit in the 20th century, exploring the links between the physical and the mental, and the possibility of a universal wisdom that unifies religious and metaphysical traditions. This interchange coincides with an increasingly tense political climate in Europe. As the so-called third position nationalism spread, a new war seemed imminent. Huxley perceives with alarm the rise of what they call mob mentalities, as he refers to fascism and communism, systems that, for him, offered security to the individual at the expense of their inner freedom. By 1935, he joined the British pacifist movement Peace Pledge Union, convinced that collective violence represented the denial of human conscience. 2 years later, in 1937, he and his wife Maria moved to California in the United States, looking for a healthier climate and an environment more conducive to thought and creation. Far from turbulent Europe, which was heading toward war in the following years before, during, and after World War II, at the time of the events of the bloodiest period in human history. His work reflects this spiritual and philosophical evolution with novels such as Eyeless in Gaza from 1936, After Many a Summer, Dies the Swan from 1939, Time Must Have a Stop from 1944, and Ape and Essence from 1948. The latter was set in a future devastated by atomic war and denounced the excesses of technical rationality and the progressive dehumanization of the 20th century. From that inner search was born his other masterpiece called The Perennial Philosophy in 1945. In this work, Huxley seeks to bring together the spiritual threads that united the most diverse traditions. His purpose was to show that beyond particular creeds and rituals, there was an essential truth shared by all mystical doctrines. For him, this was the relationship between the human being and what he called the ultimate reality. The work revolved around three approaches: nature, ultimate reality, and the ends or purposes of man. Secondly, what was the only divine reality that sustained the changing world of things, lives, and minds? And the third approach, what was the way in which the human being can learn this reality and achieve his spiritual destiny? For Huxley, The perennial philosophy affirmed that everything that exists participates in a single divine substance, an eternal principle, which is the source and end of existence. The purpose of life, according to this view, was to recognize that essential unity between the individual and the divine, to discover within the human being what the universal foundation was that sustained all things. However, Aldous Huxley warns that in order to understand this unique and ultimate reality, man must first transform himself morally and spiritually. Only the one who is loving, pure of heart, and poor in spirit, according to him, could access that truth. Virtues such as love, compassion, and understanding intelligence are, in this sense, not only moral qualities, but also epistemological tools. That is, for Huxley, spiritual enlightenment is not achieved through abstract reasoning, but through the purification of the mind, the heart, and actions through the practice of these virtues. This work, for its author, also takes on a historical meaning, since Huxley sees it as a contribution to the moral reconstruction of a new society. After the war, following the devastation in Europe and the state in which the soul of the peoples involved in that conflict was left, in the face of the devastation of the 20th century, Huxley proposes a common spiritual foundation to serve as the basis for a more peaceful, more conscious, and more unified world order. After the war, what has been called the Cold War begins. And in those early days, at the end of the 1940s, Huxley's thinking began to take a humanistic and decentralizing direction. He becomes a defender of what he calls Jeffersonian democracy, based on small autonomous communities that govern themselves. Aware, and as he warned, of the risks of centralized state control, media manipulation, and technological dominance over consciousness. For Huxley, science is never neutral. Every technical application necessarily involves a moral choice. These critical stances put him under FBI surveillance, which described him as a highly respected intellectual with no communist leanings. During this time, Huxley reached the second half of his life with a deep obsession to understand the human mind beyond its apparent limits. Aldous was convinced that the human brain is not a generator of consciousness, but rather the opposite. For him, it was a kind of reducing valve that protected human beings from a higher reality, too vast to be processed. The brain, for him, was responsible for the basic functions of human life. However, this organ was neither the source of nor explained what human consciousness is, and rather distanced people from what he called total consciousness. Only mystics and visionaries, those who have broken or manipulated the behavior of the human brain, have accessed this total consciousness. This led Huxley to start engaging in some very particular experiments. And let's remember that we are narrating these events solely for educational, documentary, and pedagogical purposes, strictly adhering to YouTube community guidelines. With all these things in mind, in May 1953, Huxley takes mescaline. This is a natural substance derived from peyote, traditionally used by indigenous peoples of the Americas, and classified in its time as a hallucinogen. The dose, although small, produces a revealing result. Under its effects, Huxley retained his intellectual lucidity, thought clearly, but his visual perception acquired, according to him, an almost sacred intensity. Ordinary objects like a chair or a flower seemed to be transfigured, shining with an absolute value. What was once every day became meaningful and exciting, even sublime. He remembered feeling that he didn't need to do anything because he literally had better things to think about from then on. From this experience, Huxley continues to explore. Now he tries lysergic acid diethylamide as well as other psychedelic substances related to mescaline. Over the course of a decade, he conducts between 9 and 12 experiments in total. For him, the use of these substances was not about chemical parties or hedonistic pursuits, but rather spiritual exercises and moments of contemplation. On a philosophical level, Huxley defines this experience as, quote, a gratuitous grace. He said it wasn't something necessary, but it could help to understand states of consciousness described by mystics from both the East and the West through these substances. Huxley believed he had understood, even if only briefly, what it feels like to transcend the ego, dissolve the boundary between the self and the other, separate from individuality, and connect with total consciousness. To rest in a state that he described with a single word: gratitude. It is from this experience and these wonders that his famous essay, The Doors of Perception, was born. In it, he argued that these hallucinogenic substances could serve as shortcuts to experiences of self-transcendence. But he insists, of course, on using them with great respect, with utmost care and under control, necessarily within a proper environment and with stable mental health. The experience, according to him, could be a momentary heaven, but he also warned that it could be hell and purgatory for those who are not well prepared for these experiences. As a result of all this, in his last novel called Island, Huxley imagines a utopian society where a perfected substance called moksha is used almost like a sacrament, not to escape from reality, but to see it more clearly. That, for him, would always be his ultimate goal. Not evasion, but openness. Not escape, but lucidity. For him, these psychedelic substances were not a recreational revolution, not a fleeting pleasure, but a philosophical tool to momentarily tear away the blindfolds of what he believed to be our limited perception of the world. Of course, there have been both followers and critics of these views, who suggested that these ideas were nothing more than a kind of justification by Huxley, or a sort of disguised addiction, while for others they have been a source of great reflections and experiments. SFX. Although Aldous Huxley had settled in California since 1937, he never stopped being a man of the world. His cosmopolitan spirit keeps him constantly on the move, frequently traveling to give lectures or participate in international conferences, even when his health begins to weaken. What in his youth had been an aversion to public speaking, over the years turned into a fondness for oratory. Huxley became a brilliant lecturer, able to combine intellectual rigor with an affable calmness for the crowds who listened to him. During the 1950s and 1960s, he embarked on tours that took him through Europe, South America, and Asia. He frequently visited London, Paris, Rome, and Venice, often staying with his brother Julian and his sister-in-law Juliet. In 1958, he traveled to Peru and Brazil, where he was received with great popular enthusiasm. A Brazilian newspaper even dedicated a daily column to him titled The Wise Man. By 1961, he traveled across India on the occasion of the centenary of the birth of the poet Rabindranath Tagore, an experience that strengthened his affinity with Eastern spirituality. In the last years of his life, he participated in high-level international meetings, such as the gatherings of the World Academy of Art and Science. In Brussels in 1962, and in Stockholm in 1963, the latter just a few weeks before his death. That same year, he also attended a conference in Rome where he was received in a private audience by Pope John XXIII. His intellectual output in these last years retains the philosophical depth and lucidity that characterize his maturity. In 1958, he published the book Return to a Happy World, where he revisits the prophecies he had made about his dystopia in 1932, and he warns that the modern world is approaching them with an unsettling speed. In the final stretch of his life, Aldous Huxley is marked by a mix of painful losses. In February of 55, his first wife, Marianus, dies of cancer, just as his mother did. Huxley, who shared a whole life of affection, confidences, and thought with her. He describes her death as an amputation, but his vision of the soul transcends the pain. He firmly believes that Maria survives and continues to grow, keeping a happy memory of her, free from bitterness. A year later, in March of 56, he marries Laura Arcara, in whom he finds a spiritual companion who will stay with him until the end. sharing with him the same inclination towards introspection, mysticism, and exploring the world. By May of 1960, Huxley receives a diagnosis of tongue cancer. The doctors recommend a radical surgery, but he refuses to undergo the operation. In order not to affect his ability to speak and to teach, he prefers radiotherapy, which gives him temporary improvement. Although the illness reappears in 1962 and 1963, Huxley endures the illness with an almost scientific serenity. He continues writing and reflecting from his room, works in pajamas, or dictates to a recorder. When his strength fails him, his stoicism and mental clarity impress those around him. A year before this, in May 1961, another small tragedy befell him, as a fire destroyed his house in Los Angeles. It consumed his library, his manuscripts, and the letters from his first wife. But instead of lamenting, Huxley faces the tragedy with detachment. He says he feels, quote, extraordinarily clean, as if the fire had purified something more than just his material possessions. In his last book, called Literature and Science from 1963, Huxley seeks to reconcile the two great fields of human knowledge, the rational and the poetic. Despite the persistence of the cancer he suffers from on his deathbed, he still dictates fragments of his last essays, where he concludes his meditation on the union between art and transcendence. Finally, on November 22, 1963, while the world is shaken by the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Huxley dies quietly at his home in Los Angeles. A few hours before his passing, his wife Laura recounts that the weakened man asked her in writing for a dose of lysergic acid diethylamide, the substance he had studied so much as a means of spiritual expansion. She administers the substance to him tenderly, guiding him with words of comfort, speaking to him about the light and the love toward which he should go. According to her, it is a conscious, lucid, and almost mystical transition, the culmination of an entire life dedicated to exploring the limits of the human spirit. That was the earthly end of Aldous Huxley, the refined British young man who in the world of ideas traveled from the pessimism of the early century. With the dream of a dystopian future, not very far from our current reality, he makes a rediscovery of ultimate realities through the study of metaphysics, to finally end up studying the limits of the human mind, even using psychotropic stimulants. And what about the way the human mind related to that higher reality he so longed to observe and study, leaving behind a whole body of significant intellectual work, which is well worth being carefully studied by future generations, and a soul deeply sensitive to beauty, ethics, and the spiritual dimension of existence. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I remind you that your support means a lot to us by leaving your comments, giving us a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reinaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to all of you.